which is part of the Futures of Design Education talk series that's run by a Design Research Society Education Special Interest Group. I'm trying to avoid acronyms, folks, but we often refer to that group as the DRS EGSIC for short. I'm James Carezzo. I'm one of the DRS EGSIC conveners. As Derek said, just letting you all know that we are recording. You can also access all of our past recordings on YouTube, and I will drop the link into the chat shortly. And the best way to learn about any future events that are hosted by DRS EDSIG is following us on Eventbrite, and I'll drop the link in for that as well. On with today. One of EGSIG's current missions really is to strengthen our connections with vital and important design education research and practices. And we are delighted to welcome Julia, Yaw and Lawrence today for what promises to be vital, important and a fascinating set of presentations and discussions. Julia Jenjezwa has done the hard work of putting today's event together and giving it such a thoughtful curation. It's been really, really popular. This has been one of our most popular events in terms of ticket sales. So clearly it's resonating with a lot of people as well. So we want to say, or I want to say on behalf of the EGSIG convening group, thank you very much to Julia, Lawrence and Yaw for agreeing to share today. Julia will be your host today. And Julia, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, James. And a very special thank you to the entire DRS EDSIG for supporting and just being very gung-ho from the very get-go about supporting this talk. So thank you very much. I have a few slides to just show the inspiration behind why I thought this event was critical at this time. So why this event? Why now? If you open a lot of African history books, you might find that they are titled pre-colonial, colonial, and then post-colonial. And that the very definition of time and of African history is defined by colonization. And I think about what are the ways in which specific futures, specific design signatures, real design movements are also obscured by the very way in which we measure time by colonization. The second reason that I thought this, to bring this call was this idea that I brought up when I was working on my master's thesis. So as a bit of background, I'm an engineer and I'm a designer and a recent graduate of the Stanford Masters in Design Impact Program. And during this program, I was studying the idea of going beyond leapfrogging, critiquing these words that are used to define African innovation, where we say leapfrogging, appropriate technology, and the ways in which they assume that the future is predefined and Africa is just the best we can do is catch up to the rest of the world, and trying to think what might it look like to chart alternative futures, to chart futures that are locally and contextually informed, and futures that don't really exist. So this strong belief in individual human potential, particularly for Africans, these are the two reasons. This was my impetus for reaching out to Leslie Ann, to James, and the entire DRS EDSIG community. Towards this, luckily, I'm very lucky and happy to introduce our speakers today. And this whole point is to kind of bring together more African voices or more people thinking and talking about these, to break down silos and hopefully instill a movement of people who are really thinking and talking about this work of defining locally and contextually relevant futures. So to introduce our speakers today, we have Dr. Yaw Ofosu-Asare, a design researcher, educator, and author whose work critically examines the limitations of Western-centric design education. His research calls for reimagining of pedagogies that center Indigenous, local, and non-Western knowledge systems, challenging dominant narratives and fostering inclusive, culturally grounded approaches to design futures. And also today, we're going to have Lawrence Okoth from Uganda, calling in from Uganda today, an industrial designer, design director at Design Without Borders Africa, and lecturer at the SASA College of Industrial Design in Uganda. His journey with SASA details the process of developing a product design curriculum rooted within African design intelligence. Yaw and Lawrence, thank you so much for your participation and being so eager to join us in this talk today. And I'll hand it over first to Dr. Yaw.
Thank you, Julia, for organizing this, and thank you for reaching out to me. It's an honor to be in front of the SIG group, and I'm really excited to talk about it. This is something I've been working on through my master's, through my PhD. So it's something that really brings a fire in my belly, if that's the right thing to say. So I'm just going to share my screen. You're going to see it. You all see my screen now? Yeah. So my name is Yaw. I just want to reintroduce myself. So in Ghana, what we do is we give names based on the day you were born. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So 1 in every 7 Ghanaian boy you meet is probably called Yaw. Everybody born on a Thursday is called Yaw. And this really brings me to my research. So when I came to Australia to do my PhD, like growing up, I've always been asked about my name. Like people, when I ever in a new class or I go to the hospital or everything, be like, why don't you have an English name? And that's something everybody kept asking me. And I was like, I was a kid. I didn't really think about it much. I was like, English name. And everybody would be like, why don't you have an English name? And these were me growing up in Ghana and people asking me the question. So when I came to Australia doing my PhD, I was like, why? One day I was sitting, I was like, why do people care about my English name? Why should I have an English name? And I even asked my dad, why don't you have an English name? Like, why do you need an English name for? And I never understood it. And that took me through the long journey of trying to rediscover myself and understand why people ask that specific question of having an English name. So that brought me, it was like, why do people, it was like, okay, colonization shaped the mindset so much that people care so much about having an English name. So that simple question of what is your English name then led me to really to understand myself and really to unpack my identity. And using design, because I'm a graphic designer, so using design is like really wanting to understand these notions of self, these notions of identity, these notions of belonging, and how these translate in our everyday lives, everyday design practices. So that leads me to envisioning a future where a future towards an African-centered approach in design, where Africa is just not, it's not just a symbolic, or we just don't talk about it. We really look into the self. For me, decolonization is about the self, decolonizing the mind, decolonizing like what Tongo said, like decolonizing the mind, really understand who you are and really placing those things in your design practices, and really understanding as an African, as a Black person, understanding these things and saying, who am I? How do I translate this into a design practice? How does this then translate to community? Designing for a community whose identity are represented in their day-to-day lives, in the design, in the spaces they find themselves, the visuals they see. So I grew up in Ghana in the 90s. So I was born in the 90s. And that was, I guess, as Julia said, Africa has been defined by colonial, post-colonial, decolonial, these timeline. So during the 50s, 60s, that's Ghana becomes the first country that gets independence. It becomes this push for decolonizing. Kwame Nkrumah is there, Frank Fanon was there. They are writing, they are discussing about how do we decolonize the African, how do we build a nation, for people who have been colonized for 400 years. And then you get to the 70s with Cold War, famine, coup d'etats, this long 60s to the 80s, where this long struggle to identify yourself or build a country, and with coups, with a lot of wars in Africa. And then you start the 90s with a lot of privatization, where there's this understanding of the IMF comes in, the World Bank comes, this understanding of a liberal a liberal society, where like a capitalist African liberal society. So this is the period where I was born. And then throughout the 2000s, the computer comes, the arrival of the internet. I remember this really stood out as a kid. I was like in primary school, and I remember them gathering us in front of the school and showing us one computer for the headmistress. So we all gathered, and I was like looking at this computer. I was like, wow, this is really like, there was one computer in the whole school, and we had to have a gathering for the headmistress to show us. And I was like, one day, I would always look at the computer. I was like, one day I want to play with it. Like, I was like, oh, that's pretty. And then I go home and my dad tells me, oh, they also brought us a computer, but they said the computer has to stay in an air-conditioned room. The computer can never go out of the air-conditioned room. So I was like, oh, that's why the headmistress kept it in her office. So this is the timeline I'm growing up with. I'm growing up also in a place where a lot of it's defined by colonial structures. I'm growing up in the western part of Ghana, like Sekendi Takrady. So it's this colonial, the first port was built there. So this colonial architecture where I'm navigating through these spaces, seeing going to my mom, visit her in the market after school, seeing this colonial, a lot of castles, slave castles, a lot of the Danish castles, the British castles. So I'm seeing all these things as a kid. I'm not really understanding these things. I'm just seeing it. So these things come back to me when I start doing my PhD. It's like, this is what defines who I am. This struggle, this tension between the colonial understanding of who I am and who am I as an African. So then I think about it as like, how do I bring it into my work? How do I bring it into my design practices? So then the first question I ask is, who gets to design the world? Like, this question it's like, who has designed the world we live in? Has the world we live in been designed for Africans? Do we really belong to this world? Who designed the world for us? Who designed the spaces we live in? Who designed the visuals we see? Who designed the curriculum we teach in? We teach in Africa, we teach in Ghana as Black people. What are we learning? And what is design meant for? Even the word itself, design, becomes you think about, it's like, what do you mean by design? Because in a lot of Ghanaian languages, in Twi, we don't have that word design. We treat design very differently. We treat design as part of the whole art, where you can't separate design from spirituality. Like, design just don't become a function. It's not a Bauhaus style where it's just merely functional. Design is part of a whole setup of it's spiritual, it's functional, it's aesthetics. And then how do we live in a world where how the world is designed we are not part of the whole, the setup, the visuals, the spaces we live in. So how do we come at it? Like, how do we live in a world where the world itself is not designed for an African or a Black man? So then I always think also, when you think about the world in terms of, it wasn't just a long period. Of course, growing up in Ghana, you're always confronted with the slave castles. Like, the slave castles are so visible, so present on the coast. Every part of the coast is like dotted with a lot of slave castles. And it wasn't, if you think, it wasn't just, it's a 400 year of unpaid labor. And it's like free labor to the West, to develop the West, where they go 400 years of just shipping 30 million plus people across the Atlantic. And also, it was a 400 years of aesthetic control. So everything you see, every building, every visual is controlled by the West. Like, it's such, the buildings you see, how things are designed, it's just this control of aesthetics, this control of art, it's the control of design. So you need to also consider how, while ancestors were working in plantation and built cities, of our ways of knowing, our visual languages were displayed in glass boxes, cataloged, measured, made into style guides for empires. Our art was not taught, it was taken, it was reframed, stripped by ritual meaning and authorship, and sold back as art, as inspiration. So you think about all these things where a lot, they take so much. You look at, give an example, like the Benin Kingdom, the Ashanti Lost Gold was, where they take it, use it as inspiration and sell it back to us. Like they take it, it's like, okay, how it's, and then it's similar to even like how the economic setup is. Like they exploit the resources, take it back to the West, and then give us back in grants and loans, and then expect us to pay back. It's just this deep exploitation of the African, of who we are. So these are all things that are in the backdrop of like how the modern society is now. So that brings me to the core of what I want to talk about today. Is about the self. How do we? Because I love this quote by Frank Fanon. He said, "Colonization is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip. It turns to the past, the oppressed people, and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it." So then, when I speak of the self in design, I don't mean the liberal individual, the portfolio bearing post-industry creative subject. I mean the self that Fanon described as self-fractured by colonization, physically disoriented by the gaze, structurally shaped by exclusion, yet alive in resistance. And design, as I've talked about, as we inherited, was never meant for the self, was never meant for the African self. The colonial project did not just take land. They took the right to define oneself. They made aesthetics and hierarchy. It assigned value to sight, to form, to color, to voice, coded through power. So what does it mean then to design as that self? Not despite grief, but with it. Not hiding rage by channeling it. To design as an African or Black on African self is not an aesthetic gesture. You just don't put I'll talk about this. You just don't put Edinkra symbols on a UI, UX, and then you think you've decolonized it. It's it has to be a political act. It is a resistance to the amnesia of the colonization demands. And what Ngugi Watongo urges, that the decolonizing of the mind is both the start and the end of all liberation. So when we design, when we design a community, we are not doing outreach. We are returning design to its pre-colonial roots, where function, beauty, knowledge, and spirit were never separate. So how the Western model, I always ask you, how can we innovate? The African-centered model, how can we remember together and build forward from that remembering? And you see, ever since working in Australia, there's this push for inclusion of Indigenous perspective. It's something Frank Fanon really posits it in a very nice way. He talks about when they get bored of their nice buildings, their beautiful alleys, their structures, they will come back and trying to look for inspiration from the Indigenous people, because they will be bored and they will come. So we need to really underpin who we are. We need to really understand that we are coming from a long backdrop of 400 years of struggle, 400 years of aesthetic control, and we need to unpack those things through self. So as a designer, it's always up to you to then understand these things about yourself as a Black or African designer. Even as a white person, you need to really understand that this is the world we've built for ourselves. How do we include and make everybody belong? Because we can't build a world where we have people struggling, there's so much struggle in the world where people don't feel belong and the world is not built for them. We need a world where everybody becomes a winner. And it's not just about symbols. It's not just about putting symbols there, putting beautiful. It's not symbolic. If your design process is extractive, if your team is monoculture, if your user testing never left the city, if adding Kente to your layout is not liberation, it's branding. Don't put Edinkra symbols on your interfaces if your entire UX model is based on a Euro-American assumption. Don't speak of inclusion if your app erases African languages. And it's so interesting. Siri never picks up my accent. I've never told Siri anything. Siri has understood me one time. It's like, why? Why is my accent not part of the whole Apple setup? It's like that's not decolonization, that's decoration. that custom, its performance. We are always performing, and it risks becoming soft, marketable form of erasure. So let's try as much as possible to design for the community, to bring people into the design. When we are designing, let's not just sit in the boardroom and make those decisions. Let's go there and have a conversation and ask them. I always wonder why in Africa we have streets packed with people, market people. We build these beautiful roads and then we seem to forget that this is the problem we have. How do we find solutions to this problem? How do we add that? We know people are going to hawk on the streets, but we still do it, and then it becomes a problem. It's like, okay, we have in Ghana every 4 years they seem to have a problem of trying to go and take the market women off the street, but it never works because they become like why don't you build a space where you have them as part of the whole setup? It's just this thing where this orienting thing where we always go back. So I also want to talk about as I've mentioned, it's not just about it's a living method. It's not an aesthetic. Like it has to be a method where it has to be positional, it has to be relational, it has to be methodological. It's not just aesthetics. It's not just about putting beautiful things. It has to be something where it's relational. It's always going back and forth. And it has to be based on your positionality and understanding who you are. I want to talk about my work. So I have quickly, like Julia mentioned, I have 2 books which was based on my thesis. So one is Decolonizing African Design and one is African Design Futures. But what I'm really excited about is more, because what I'm really excited about is more the practical, the field work that I want to do. So there's 2 works that stand out. There's a culture encyclopedia. So I'm working with a team in Ghana where we are building an archiving a culture encyclopedia to have a lot of an archive for cultural element across Africa. So we are starting with Ghana, and then we'll then go to different African countries. So this is something we've started develop, but we're starting having consultation processes. So it's more to do with the methodology. I'm more excited about the methodology. So the methodology of how do we include these relational positionality element in what we do. Because just building a website and putting old pictures and symbols and have meaning, like it has to be something where it has to be in conversation with community. It has to be in conversation with people we are designing for, because we can't just eliminate the native form who we always have to. And also another project I'm really excited about, and I'll be going to Ghana very soon to start, is building integrated safe spaces for people with disability. And on the surface, it looks like building. So the idea is to build safe spaces, UI, UX, like accessible. But what I'm excited more about is the methodology, where using decolonized methodology, using storytelling, using story ethnography, just capturing those rich, and then using like the people like being co-researchers, where I'm not just going there to tell us like, let's do this together. How can I learn from you? How can you also learn from me? Let's do this relational thing. And then how do we bring the two together? So this living methodology where it's a back and forth and co-designing and co-researching and sitting down. It's like, let's do this together. What are your problems? How do we involve community? How do we talk to, how do I understand these issues? And then try and build accessible software, which Apple, which will then, because I don't want to, like, it's not a situation where something is built and it can never be used, because it's a lot of people go with a copy and paste approach where they copy Western things and go and paste, and it never works. So these are the 2 things I'm really passionate about, and I'll be working through this year. As for the books, it's out there and it's doing very well. I guess it brought me here, so it's doing pretty well. And I want us to, like, also in terms of, I guess, going to the future, these are the 3 words I want it to be the takeaway from. It's about return, it's about change and refusal. Like, these are the three words that I think going into the future, it has to really be at the back of every design process you go through. Return, how do you return to the pre-colonial era? How do you absorb element? How do you go to community? How do you culturally contextualize what you're designing? How do you change? How do you restructure? How do you transform? And then you need to, as far as possible, refuse the Western future. Like, colonized future is not a Western future in African skin. A colonized future is not a Western framework with African aesthetics pasted on top. It's a radical restriction of where we begin and who leads it. It's the refusal of linear time, extractive logic, and one size fits all thinking. It is a return to rhythm, to ritual, to circle. A future shaped by care, not control, by presence, not power. So that brings me to. So these are 4 questions I want everybody to, going forward, like, start thinking about it. Are your classrooms places of reproduction or reimagining? Whose history are we building with? Who gets to be called a designer? Are your methods extractive or relational? So these are the questions. These are some of the questions I want people here to start thinking about. If you are a lecturer, if you are a teacher, if you teach in studio work, think about, are your classroom place of reproduction? What are you telling the student? Are you adding your own perspectives to it? I always tell my students, like, I always try as much as possible to tell them, like, it's not trying to think outside the box. They're giving with time. Like, how do you think about time? Is such a linear thing. Like, time, it's like in Africa, that's why we have African time, because it's never us. It's not for us. Like, this linear notion of 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. We have such a secular way of thinking about it. Time is measured in very differently. So how do you bring all these things into your design practices? These are like ideas you need to think about when you are building, when you are designing, and then who gets to be called a designer? And are your methods extractive or relational? Are you doing the back? Are you giving and taking, and are you just taking and not giving? Like, you need to think about all these things, and the history we are building, or how, like, the history now, what we are doing now, how is it going to shape the future? So decolonizing design means decolonizing the self. It's not an invitation, it's a demand, not to be seen or not, but to be centered. And then moving forward, these are some practical ideas. I think real practical ways to decolonize design practice. To co-create, don't consult. Build in native languages. Try as much as possible to design in public. Add culture, add community. Start with Indigenous knowledge system. Use ethical design to redistribute assets and ownership. And start with the land you are on. We all have a part to play. We can't just say, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing. I don't really understand it. Even if the curriculum doesn't allow you to, because even if the curriculum doesn't allow you to put just try as much as possible to try and bring your own positionality as a Black person. I always find it very fascinating when I talk to friends and I ask them, what sort of, like in their PhD, what sort of methodology are you using? What sort of theory are you using? It's like, I'm using this. They mentioned some positive. I was like, who are you writing the research for? You're writing the research for Africans. You've situated the whole thing in Ghana, and then you are doing all these big theories, and it's not post-colonial, it's not colonial, it's not decolonial, like, it's not culturally relevant to. You do all these things and you go and become a policy director, and you sit there and you think about why your policies are not working. You need to contextualize these things and bring it and use your local knowledge, your positionality to then understand the problem. Because you can't just, because you have this whole argument about subjectivity and objectivity and where is the truth coming from, what's the real, like, what is true and what is untrue, and if Indigenous knowledge systems are true or untrue. And because there's so much storytelling, it's all oral traditions, you can't rationalize or make it like logic. It's so sad to see people do. So I feel like it always has to be culturally context. You need to bring your position. You need to really understand yourself, who you are, the self. Understand that you are a product of a long history of long history, and it's made you who you are. It shapes your thinking, shapes who you are, shapes how you dress, it shapes everything you do. How do you bring those things into your design practices as a Black or as an African person? Yeah. That's me. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much, Yaw. Thank you for these prompts and very clear call to action, rounding it out. So to make the most of the time, I'll hand it over to Lawrence. Please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much. And many thanks to Dr. Shao for such a, Dr. Yaw, sorry, for a powerful presentation. I think there's a lot of what's in there is probably going to surface again in what I'll talk about. So just let me try and share. Okay, just help me confirm if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Maybe Julia, just let me know.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Perfect. All right, so lots to share. And I was just discussing with my teammates about how many of these slides I should probably take out, because there's lots to talk about on this topic. But I'll try to go through all of them and see, if time allows for us to look at each and every piece. I have a lot to do in terms of crafting the current curriculum, so the current African design practices, as well as education around this topic at the moment. There's still a long way to go with that as well. And I hope these slides are still showing.
Yes.
So yes, just quickly introducing myself. My name is Lawrence. I work with sort of in three capacities. Some of this personal. So at Design Without Borders as the Director of Design and Innovation, and at the Object Lab, which is a personal space for exploration, experimentation, which is the Object Lab. And then at the SASA School of College of Industrial Design, which has been newly set up, where we are trying to introduce the first formal and accredited curriculum in industrial design. I think very likely in the region, so in the East African region, we don't know yet of another curriculum that teaches industrial design. And that's only because I don't want to say for sure that there's no industrial design curriculum within East and Central Africa. But just going straight to what we do at Design Without Borders particularly, and showing the team that contributes to this work. I always credit this team for the work that we do, but then also for the influence that they've also had on me as a designer, the conversations that we share, and the way we all respond to something that surprises us or something that is familiar. I think there's a lot that we learn from each other and the experiences that we go through together. But to speak also very specifically about the diversity of backgrounds. So of course, Design Without Borders initially was a very international office, but the Design Without Borders today is very different from what was there before. So we have a lot of sort of local representation, local in terms of Africa. We have team members from Kenya. We've had team members from Nigeria, of course, Uganda, and as well as partners from all over the continent and as all over the globe. We have different backgrounds as well. My background is in architecture, as well as a couple of my teammates. But we also have urban designers. We've had anthropologists, sociologists. We've had product designers for sure. Thomas's background is in international development. And apologies to Thomas if I get his background wrong a couple of times. I just hope I got it right this time. But while we speak about personnel and the idea of training, of design training, I think what might actually help is reflecting on my personal journey in getting to a place where to the level that I'm working at right now, and that's a journey that spans about 10 years of practice and 5 years of school. So what you're looking at right now is probably even going way before that, because I started to develop interests in architecture as early as 11 years old. So being surrounded by people that knew about architecture, knew about design, but of course were mostly interested in what they were seeing around them in Uganda. And so starting to pick up influences like Frank Lloyd Wright, Daniel Libeskind, Zaha Hadid. These are names that are pretty famous in the architectural space, but also very particularly for their style and for their approach. I think Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, is fairly well known for his balance of planes, and also, of course, being able to create these cozy interiors while still creating modern design. Daniel Libeskind, I'll not talk too much about this since we have a lot to go through, but really look, if we could just look at the language of the design that's represented on this slide. This is where most designers would typically begin, is by looking at design that comes from outside of the continent, and then seeing how that starts to influence a student project. So these are projects that I've done. These are sketches from first year, second year of architecture schools. So 2009, 2010, very, very early on, as we start to see, of course, that the angles from the work of Daniel Libeskind is already showing in a student's work at that level. And the curves of Zaha Hadid already showing within the work of a student at that level. And yet these are years where the student is really supposed to explore and go beyond what they've seen or what they think architecture is supposed to be. And this is later on in my 5th year, so that's 2014, where the language is really, I've started to develop this, I've sort of settled for a design language that's all about curves. But then my excuse for including African, a sort of an African sentiment is, in patterns that quite frankly had no foundation. So there's, I don't remember exactly where I got these specific patterns from, but I do appreciate that at the time, everybody flows through a journey. And so at the time, this was my to Africanize or make my work a bit more Afrocentric. But then going very quickly so 5th year that's the last year of architecture school, and so starting to get into practice. The first place that I worked with, fortunately and thankfully, was Design Without Borders. So I joined as an intern. And already starting to learn how to use the tools. Of course, Julia, you probably know about SolidWorks as well as many others in the audience. I was really fascinated by this tool because all this time I'd been using architectural software that mostly allowed me to think of things in large scale. And when you think in large scale, it's very easy to be removed from the needs of the person that might be using what you're designing. So this was me designing my first product, and this was basically a clothing rack, a personal clothing rack. But it was very interesting thinking about exactly what I would need. And of course, being a very young bachelor, I almost had nothing. On that clothing rack. But this is also an interesting slide, because this is how that clothing rug arrived at my place. I didn't know that the carpenter was going to transport it using a motorbike. And so needs around, very contextual needs around transportation, obviously, but then also trying to drive down the cost of your project. A project that I got into very early, also at Design Without Borders, started to exhibit the need for us to work for teamwork. So in the photo to the top, on the top right, you'll see it's a photo that involves people of different races, people of different age, people obviously of different fashion taste. So all these differences, this group sort of defines it doesn't even begin to fully explore the range of diversity that you could end up with within a project group. But then also, trying to make the problem that we are solving a bit more tangible through these models that were nothing like what I had made in school. And then interacting with design at a scale also that I had never interacted with in school. I was very used to designing very large projects, cultural molds, airports, if you like. And here I was using those skills to remodel a wheelbarrow in order to improve ergonomic experiences for people that were manufacturing. In this case, this was biobriquettes. I then went on to study at the Politecnico in Milan, and like Dr. Yaw suggested, when you're in a different context, you start to feel a bit more pressure and the need to sort of distinguish yourself. And so I felt this as well, and that started to show in the projects that I was completing. Very, very boldly starting to bring back my idea of African pattern language, but then also trying to look at the forms that I employed within my projects, and then also a bit more more African concepts around what it means to eat together. And so this sitting around what could easily have been a fireplace thousands of years ago, but then also trying to emphasize that a bit more with this skylight in the center of the kitchen. And of course, a niche area where stories can be continued, or where one can play, children can play games as they wait on their parents cooking, which is typically what would happen in an African sort of domestic traditional setting. So I'll be putting in some of these reflections every once in a while in the presentation. And one that I will start with, ADE being African Design Education, should embrace a globalized world. This is the world that we live in, but I think we should be critical of the influences that come from the world around us. But again, what's also really important is collaborative, participatory design process. I think in teaching students, design students of the future, we need to teach for cross, multi, inter, and transdisciplinary practice, because I think that's when you truly start to go beyond personal biases, but then opening yourself up to the differences that exist in how people think and how people apply their knowledge. This started to become more evident while I was working at Design Without Borders, is that the role of the designer is quickly evolving, and that with the advent of participatory design or participatory design thinking, human-centered design, user-centered design methodologies, we are starting to see the designer becoming more of a facilitator of process rather than an expert. Also, it's very likely that in the future, come in these illustrations about where exactly the designer stands within the process. I'll strip some of these. So again, at Design Without Borders, one of the things that would happen that was that I think really fueled the office and sort of caused many of us to stay with the practice was this idea of cross-cultural design practice, where there was we had designers that would go to countries like Norway, and we'd have designers coming over to Uganda, or designers moving over to countries like Indonesia and the like. So there was this very intentional exchange of designers that sort of drove the early concept of what Design Without Borders was supposed to be. And within this space, I found mentors that sort of really helped me change my thinking about what it means to design in Africa. Here you can see, in this group, you can see, so these 4 designers, I wish I could say more, a bit more about them, because they are amazing. They are very pivotal contributors to my perspective on design today. But they came into Uganda and sort of pioneered the registration of Design Without Borders as a business. And then we had Abigail, who is still with us today, and Derek moved over to Norway to work with the team over there, as you can see in that image. And this is a tradition that's sort of continued today. This is 2022, 3 to 4 months, but that is very intentional about that cross-cultural practice. Again, this image, you have Nigerians, you have Kenya, you have a Nigerian, you have a Kenyan, and you have an Israeli project coordinator. The fellowship coordinator is typically actually studied product and service design, since that's a course that can, until recently with SASA Industrial Design College, could not be found within Uganda or much of East Africa. So another reflection is that African design education, the future of this, cannot be limited by or defined by racial differences. I think African design sentiments can come from anywhere, and there's a lot, again, with reflecting on the influence of globalization, there's a lot that we can borrow from different contexts. But what really is important instead is context, cultural values, and the power of the lived experience. I think what worked with Design Without Borders back then was that designers, foreign designers, were required to stay in the context for extended periods, living with the locals and participating in local projects, but of course also learning from the local designers. I just wanted to quote this. I had this very recently from Roxanne. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. Roxanne Ahmed. That the global South, Africa included, are not necessarily forging anew, but finally and rapidly remembering who they are. And Dr. Yaw also talked about this, us asking the question, how can we remember who we are and move forward? I think, again, Dr. Yaw was showing is really about that history we must understand goes back, at least in understanding the African traditional society as it might exist today. That history goes back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years back. And we can see that that's evidenced with prehistoric carvings that exist all around the continent, but very ingenious structures that have been set up by various the great African civilizations throughout history. So I will also just go through this very quickly. So in thinking about what Roxanne's quote on memory, I think it's important that we understand that by unearthing our history, we start to see that there's a lot that we were already, and we are simply sort of bringing back. Ubuntu philosophy, for instance, is probably a very is right at the core of what human-centered design practice is, and therefore human-centered design practice is not necessarily new, but a sort of modern manifestation of principles that existed hundreds of thousands of years ago. Looking at societies in West Africa, all over the African continent, emphasizing communal participation in things in activities as strenuous as construction or house maintenance, as we can see every year. I think within the summer in Burkina Faso, the Kasena community in the country, they do this ritual practice where the women together start to maintain the homes and rescreed them, restore ornaments that might have faded. But we also have architects that are starting to bring this language back. And I like what Dr. Yaw said before. How might you be able to build in your native language? I think that was a very powerful question. Architects like Francis Gehry have a very interesting approach to their practice. And I've just highlighted just one project here. I don't want to say too much about it in the interest of time, but participation is a very important part of how he practices architecture, both in the design, but very importantly in the construction of his work. Also highlighting some interesting, really, really complex applications of computation, for instance, that is supposedly a very foreign concept at the moment, or at least understood by many as being a foreign concept. The research of people like Ron Aglash looking into African fractals and how those sort of determine patterns, developing these, what he's calling, I think he called them cultural algorithms that determine what homesteads look like, but can be extended to algorithms that now feed computation tools that we use today in architecture and product design. So another reflection here is African design education needs to recognize that it's actually nurturing leaders in technological advancement. This is who we've always been, and so that too is not a foreign space for us. We can get as technological as we want, but again, I think we need to remember the first reflection, which is to be very critical of the influences. And so what do your concepts mean? I think there was a very interesting, so again, Dr. Yaw. So whose histories are we building with? Whose information are we building with? Whose concepts are we building with? I think is very important. And just passing this over very, very quickly, we also do have a very painful past. So from the transatlantic slave trade, the effects of the Industrial Revolution that we actually see today with climate change, the scramble and partition for Africa and the selling of all sorts of chunks of land, the selling of the African imagination, as well as participation in wars that were never supposed to be part of, and this whisking away all sorts of resources, both soft and hard in terms of imagination, as well as actual people and minerals. Sort of using that to then understand that designers can no longer step away from sensitive issues. I think designers do that a lot. I think activism is very important for designers, designers of the future, designers of now, sociology, as well as entrepreneurship. I add entrepreneurship because right now, as we can see with the development aid and how that has advanced, and how Africans never really get, authentic sort of donations. There's always sort of a string attached here and there. I think we need to be able to fund our own development, so to speak. We need to be able to fund our own design work, and I think this can be done through entrepreneurship. So what I'm saying here is we need to confront those issues, and we need to realize that activism, sociology, and entrepreneurship are purely within the designer's domain. I will go past this one quite quickly, just again to catch up with. So yes, another reflection, I think I already remember, as I already mentioned this, future African design education. I think doing African design means we need to commit to remembering who we are, and so unearthing a history of not just African design, obviously, but a history of Africa, and what are the things that define us as a people. So I'll sort of go through that last part of this presentation by highlighting just one example of a project that we've done at the office. This was a vertical garden project, and you can see the client, Paul, in the top left corner. This was his prototype when he came to us to sort of rethink how he could create this garden for more people, and so really start to scale it. The first thing that we did, obviously, within our human-centered design process was to involve his clients, so his people within his network. And so these were farmers. What we were trying to work towards at this moment was a compact farm for urban farmers. And so very specifically, the urban poor, but also extending to the middle class that might not have enough space to sort of plant lush gardens of with all sorts of foods and vegetables. And the aim here, the target here was also to increase the consumption of vegetables. And so we went into, with that group, we went into what we typically do, which is carry out some research. In this case, we are trying to understand what their homesteads look like, or where they currently have their farms that they've just purchased. If you've got a farm and you've purchased it from Paul, where exactly is that farm within your homestead, and how is it performing in that location? But also going through a process of voting, where we invited the participants to let us know, to score, and let us know what within a potential criteria could inform the design of the garden. But not only that, also what kind of plants, what kind of vegetables would you like to grow on the garden? These are sketches from the participants, and it's very hard, of course, to see if you don't really go into detail. It's to see exactly where they pinpoint the location of their current gardens. But the idea here was to understand what the current situation is, why they're there, and how we can start to improve. One of the concepts that one of the as much light as possible from all directions. And so we went on to study different typologies of homes, urban middle-class homes, as well as urban informal settlements. So you can see there's a very informal settlement here. And then you have more of the apartments that might have very little space for a garden, maybe a balcony or so. We had concepts that were proposed by the team. We brought these to the participants and started to ask them this. We started to ask them to start to give feedback, but also to more specifically cost and tell us how much they thought each of these concepts would have as a real garden, because again affordability came out on top while we were building the design criteria. So you can see already this one they thought would cost about 600,000 shillings. Okay, maybe an average of 450,000 shillings. I'd like to convert that to dollars. think that would be about $120. And then that one about 410. So more or less around the same region for all the gardens. So it was up to us to try and take that cost even lower, because that wasn't really going to work for the users. And so we started getting into mock-up building, prototyping, trying to understand again how we could reduce the cost. But another thing that kept coming up is they wanted to increase the capacity of the garden. So they wanted to have more vegetables sort of available for them within a small space. And so we started to think about how we could increase capacity, how we could develop a simple construction system and use materials that were available to us. So there were sort of two different concepts that we pursued. The one at the top is more of like a wooden frame. Sorry. So I hope you can hear me. Julia?
We're starting to lose you, Lawrence, and we just have to wrap up quickly. So I was wondering if you could kind of get into a summary and we can kind of move to the next phase. Yeah. All rich.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so sort of two concepts. I'll try to wrap up right now, Julie. So wooden frame, concrete, and that's now sort of the concrete prototype, and my son giving some feedback about where the garden should be placed. We then went on to develop a version for refugee settlements. Again, this was during the design fellowship, where we invited participation of refugee communities. We built a prototype for another wooden frame garden, which is the one on the left, but then also invited carpenters to build and see if they could sort of replicate the same garden, because the idea was that the communities should be able to construct this. Obviously, it became very, very complicated. There were very many parts, very many joints. And so we tried to redesign the garden to sort of reduce the joints, but also keep the cost really, really low. This is still at mock-up level, so it very, very rudimentary material selection. This was then, we provided some guides about how the garden could be assembled. The pattern on the right is because we wanted to use a single string to weave, to create this weave. Again, so that it's really easy to set up. It's a setup that can happen in a few hours. We tested that with the clients, and then Paul took this to the refugee settlements to sort of test out and see what they thought about what we had sent them. Of course, there were some challenges. We can see how difficult it still looked on the right, but at least there was hope that already with the mock-up that we could see some impact with this kind of design. So this is a project that's still ongoing, and so what I'm really sharing with you here is what we have at mock-up level. But I think from the process you can start to see sort of the needs for designers within, at least within the African context. I believe this sort of process would be really important. And so the skills, I hope the skills that are required for designers in this context are sort of coming out with this example. So that's my last one will be that, at least from what I see, I think something that needs to be slashed from our minds is the idea that there is an informal sector, because I think when you call something that, you're demeaning its sort of its roots, its origin. And so I think something that we totally need to slash from our minds is the idea that something can be informal. I think designers need to look at it more positively and think of it more as sort of the roots of the sort of the audience that you're designing for. So that's it. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, and such a wonderful overlaps also in these calls to remember, and a diversity of mediums from graphic design, architecture, gardening, to even design processes being represented in ways we could decolonize. Thank you so much, Derek, for extending the time a little bit. Much appreciated. I wanted to ask for questions from the community. If anyone has any questions for both Lawrence and Yaw, I will let the audience have a chance first. Oh, okay, I'm happy to ask a question. I can't see. Okay, go ahead, James.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you all. I was really interested. Well, I was interested in lots of things, but I noticed very clearly a thread running both through your framing, Julia, and through Yaw and Lawrence's talks about time. And as Yaw talked about this idea of return, and Lawrence talked about this idea of remembering. So to turn this into a question, I'm kind of wondering if any of you could say a little bit more about the ontology of time that you're kind of alluding to, or the way that you're framing time to set some of these ideas up.
Lawrence, would you like to go first? You're already unmuted.
Sorry, I seem to have a lag in the internet, so I might actually just remove my video. So yeah, the idea of time for us, at least for me, is, and again, remembrance is, I think where that all begins is in recognizing that the history of Africa has been buried. It's the authentic history of Africa has been buried. And so if we get to know what that history is as far back as possible, then we start to understand why things are the way they are and what we value it, and what has been lost and what can be restored or what can be continued. So I think for me that could go as far back as the Great Migration. I think is where I usually start with my students, is where did the Bantu migrate from rather? Where did the Nilotics and the Nilohamites and all of these groups and all of these ethnic groups, where did they come from? Who were they? Where they were? And that already takes us back as far back as 1000 BCE. And so I think we should go as far back as possible. I know that there's a challenge in actually finding this history. If we could go even farther, if we could look at the paintings, on the rock paintings, and try to understand what those cultures were about, but also architecturally, not just in terms of art, but also architecturally, in terms of design, in terms of how their societies were organized, just really unearthing all of that detail. I think it would be good that we just go as far back as possible, and that would be my response.
Yeah, that's a really very good question. Thanks, Lawrence, for talking about the history in terms of, and also I enjoyed your presentation. I think just in terms of time, because with Africa, like we measure time in terms of events, and also you need to probably understand even the Western notion of time, how time fits into this concept of capitalism, this creation of time to fit into work, like an 8-hour work. But then Africans have always looked at time of like the event, the communal. So things start when people arrive rather than things start at 10 a.m. So this idea of the differences in how people think about time, it's just this. It's a very interesting tension there already. It's like, oh, the event start at 9, but like this idea is like when people arrive is when the event starts. It's not 10 o'clock, but the Western thing is it start at 10 o'clock. So this tension there, how do you bring this into your design? How do you feed this? How do you put these things into things you design and things concept or in your research, how do you put these things together? It's a very interesting way of how people think about things and look at things. I think from I play soccer with my friends and nobody shows up on time. Nobody shows up they're supposed to start at 4 p.m. Everybody shows up at 5 p.m. And now we have a problem because it's getting to winter, it's getting dark. But then they show up on time, they show up in time for work because they have to show up. It's this idea of how these things are in tension with the Western ways of doing things and Western. So how do you bring these things? And so then it also begs the question: how do you measure productivity in Africa? How do you people go to work and then you have to measure in terms of productivity? So how do you develop policies? How do you develop these things to fit into? So how would a workplace function with these things of time? And it's always the easier route is just to go say, oh, why don't you come on time? But like, it's just, these are things that have been fed or it's like their positionality has been this culturally contextualized or it's hard written into their DNA where it's so hard to, it's like, oh, I'm coming, but like they just woke up. It's like when they tell you I'm on my way, this is when they wake up. These things are very hard. These I guess these simple concepts are always very interesting to look at and see, oh, okay, as a designer, how do I approach things? If I'm planning a space or if I'm building a market, how do I build these things? How do I put these things there? So so it's a very interesting way of looking at time, and it's just like it's a very secular way, and it's also tied to spirituality. Time, like there's always just maybe during a meeting, the first 20 minutes is like a prayer, pouring of libation, and it's like it will look like they don't respect time, but like it's that's how time is perceived, how time is understood. Yeah, so it's for me it's still interesting to me. These are things I'm unpacking and observing. I was like, okay, how do I approach this? How do I add this to if I'm going on the field doing a research, how do I add these things to it?
Thank you, Yaw. Thank you, James. I might add a little bit. I see there are more questions coming in. However, our time is capped, and I was wondering if we could continue the conversation on the LinkedIn. That's a suggestion given, or could we continue and extend? I'm going to turn to the DRS EdSig team of which of the two do you think would make the most sense at this juncture before I wrap?
Derek, do you want to come in? You in response to Julia's question?
It's a really good question. It's one of the places we know that we need to do better on this. What we don't do very well is continue the conversations after some of these events. Let's just prototype it. Let's just give it a try, Julia. Let's try keeping going on LinkedIn then. How about that? And we'll see where that goes. If that doesn't work, we'll try something else. But please feel free to keep going. We can probably keep going to the 5:30 if people want to stay or want to catch up with the recording later. So if anybody else wants to add in there's some interesting questions in the text chat. Like James, I've got loads of questions as well, but I'm going to.
Okay, I'm glad to hear it. So happy to continue on until the 30-minute mark. And thank you everyone for kind of your levity and in continuing this interesting discussion. I might note a little bit back to your question before I move back to the other questions. From my background, I work in innovation. And one thing I kept seeing was that a lot of the innovative solutions weren't working for our context. But then the future is inevitable. Like that's the thing with time, right? Is we always charge forward. But how do we charge forward when the solution or the future that's being charted for us is not aligned? We have to look back. We have to look back in order to look forward. So this is where I'm hoping that by looking back, we can recapture the intelligence, we can recapture these contextually relevant questions that allow us to chart these contextually informed future. So in a nutshell, that's why I think of time, of like looking back being a necessity for charging into the future. now that I've answered that question, I'll kind of reach out to, there's one question for you, Yaw and Lawrence, from Rashid, which says, what does an ideal future look like through your design practice? Is there space to depart from critique and towards praxis? I really think that first one very good. What does an ideal future look like for your design practice? Feel free to mute and go ahead.
Yeah, for me, it's belonging. That word really stands out to me. Just this idea of building a future where everybody feels like they belong to the future. It's like this idea where we bring everybody on board, and we have a world where like we all feel part of the world. We don't, not one is just this west non-western. Is like a hybrid system where everybody, I think a lot of people have talked, like a lot of writers have talked about it, where we have a third space. This binary notion of looking at things is not, I don't think the left, right, to like everything is like binaries, because we just see things to be good, bad, black and white. Like we need a third space. We are more complicated than that. It's not this simplistic way of looking. It's easier to look at it like it's white, it's black, but like it's a third space. People are more nuanced. People are more, they're so, like we are so complicated. We all want the same thing. Like at the end of the day, you talk to everybody, they basically want the fire. They want like, but then how do we build a world? How do we build a future where as designers, where there's a third space where we can hold space and bring everybody in and say, this is where we belong. This is where you can feel part of the world, and let's move forward, and let's all be in conversation with each other. There shouldn't be left, right, I'm black, I'm white, I'm Asian, I'm this. Let's like belonging. Let's feel belong. Let's see we able to recognize my voice for a change, and I'll be happy. It's like this idea where we have to feel belong. And so for me, that's how I want to, like, the future is for me. And also as an African, I also want to see an African continent where we've been able to fix the basic problems we have. Sometimes it's pretty sad. You are confronted with the realities of things, where you go there and you see all these things, and you feel sad. And it's like, how do we fix it? And for me, it's all about, because for me, it's the whole education system just takes you away from being part of the native. It's like it's set up in a way where you go to school, you go to this colonial system, and then they're just training you to become a white person. You speak good English, you dress well. So then how do you even feel like you're part of the native? So then you look back and say, oh, I don't really belong here. I need to move to the West. I need to walk in nice streets. I need to shop at a mall. How do we bridge those gaps for people to really care about? Then we are just basically going back to the elites becoming the middle class, elite becoming the colonial masters, because basically that's what we are doing. How do we build a world where education system where you finish and you still feel very strong to your root and native, so that you care about the land you live, you care about the people, and you care so much about helping them, not being corrupt, not stealing from them, because you don't want to do that to things you care about. So that's where I wonder, like I envision Africa. And for me, I always say like Africa is still the modern post-colonial Africa is still a very young continent. Like Ghana is like 67, so 67 years compare in America, they were having civil war. So we will get there. Like I wouldn't be surprised 200 years from now, Nigeria will be this big superpower. Like I wouldn't be surprised. It's just time, because we have such a short time in our life. We don't really get to see things changing. Like China has been able to move from the 80s to now to become a superpower. We can do it. So there's so much potential there. And design should be at the backdrop of everything we do. Like everything is design, the whole system, the complex. Yeah. So for me, that's where I want to see the future heading to.
Yeah. Dr. Yaw really completes it quite well. So I'll just add very little. I think for me, it's that last piece. I think right now Africa is constantly stuck in this vicious cycle where we're solving problem after problem after problem. It's very hard to think of the future when you can't envision tomorrow, when you think you're not going to be able to survive till tomorrow. And we confront those issues every day. Children that cannot go past past their first few weeks after being born, or women that cannot get representation, for instance, or men that are subjected to rules that they didn't really subscribe to at any point in their upbringing, or in societies that expect people to be a certain way because some master behind the curtain is asking for that to be the case. I think there's very many things that we need to sort of solve, but I'm also not saying that it's impossible for us to imagine a future, an ideal future. I think I don't have the information to build such a future. I think that again requires that we look into this history. We look into the current state. We consult each other. I think this is something that I'm still going through. Through our practice at Design Without Borders, through my interactions with students as well as fellows within the Design Without Borders Fellowship, we are constantly trying to understand what the role of products, services, environments, buildings, systems, what's the role of all these things within the current Africa, but also looking forward to what their role could be in the future Africa. I think it's very hard to answer what the ideal could be. There's a lot that we can go a very long way by, first of all, while solving the current challenges, we do interact and do some research, collaborate, speak with each other in order to understand what the role of everything, technically everything that's around us is in the future.
Thank you, Lawrence. I think what will likely be our last question for today, and thank you, James, for posting the LinkedIn post. It's definitely please tag me, Yaw, and Lawrence, and let's continue the conversation on LinkedIn. And for our last question today is, how do we tackle the issue of going back when a lot of Indigenous knowledge was passed down orally and the older generation is also passing? And this is my own context of, there's also part of colonization was erasure and destruction. How do we remember when so much has also been erased? And do we just continue with what has already been preserved? What do we do?
Maybe very quickly, I'd say it's very interesting what you'll find if you sift through what's existing, what's already existing. I think there's a lot. I've been on this journey of uncovering the history that I've just shown you for a fairly long time. We started doing these teachings in 2015, and I still haven't yet finished what's just existing. There's a lot that you can uncover from what's existing, but it's also might not be true that you might be surprised that there's actually quite a lot that's documented, because I think we say that, for instance, we say writing started in China. I don't remember what year exactly, but we also know that writing systems existed in Africa in prehistoric times. So in Sibidi script or Ankara symbols or all of these things that already were there. What can we decipher from what those symbols represent and where they came from? I think collectively we might be able to unearth a lot from the text that already exists, but it also might not necessarily be true that if you carry out your research, if we carry out archaeological digs and try to look for structures that we thought were erased but might in fact be buried under lots and lots of hundreds and hundreds of meters of earth, I think it's worth it trying to dig, and seeing what we find. A lot might have been erased. We had a lot of earth structures that simply couldn't make it past a simple flood, but we also must have had a lot of architecture that was built to survive. We don't know because we haven't yet tried to look. I think we are being convinced that these artifacts and things cannot be found, or that they were completely erased. But who says that if we actually started to dig, if we got the resources, not donations, but if we found resources to actually dig and carry out this research, in the way that it should be carried out and to the depth that it should be carried out, who is to say that we will not find information that will actually chart a path for Africa forward? Yeah. Thanks.
I'll just quickly say, like, this is something that the Ghanaian, if you're familiar with it in Krasim, it's called Sankofa. So this is something that it talks about going back to pick up this, like it's a bird, it's a bird turned its head up like backwards. So it's like going back to pick up to take out the essentials of the past. I think going back not necessarily like you're not going back like a nostalgia where you're going to pick everything. It's like, no, you're not going. You also have to admit that not everything before colonization, there were still problems like every society. I think when you need to think about it in a way where these knowledge systems are still there. They are still embedded in our proverb system. They're still embedded in our languages, the songs we sing, the ceremonies. So these are still things people are doing. It's just what the West has been able to do very well is rationalize these things into frameworks. So this idea of logic, rationalization, scientific method and this idea of this idea of rationalizing and writing it down, and as a designer, like putting them into practice. Like these, even though it's still like they are living knowledge system, living knowledge memories where it's embedded in, like I've talked about the Sankofa. So it's there. It's like just understanding that we have it. Just understanding, like, and also I think it's up to like researchers to bring those conversation up front, say this is what we like. Everything you can find, like we've talked about time, like it's a system. It's there. How do you use it then? How do you use it as a tool? So understanding that, just going like sometimes I think it becomes this thing where you have this conversation. It becomes this thing where like it's just nostalgic way of going back and saying, picking up like using Africa, like using pre-colonial Africa has this nostalgic way of looking at things, but like it's just, and then saying oral traditions, it's very subjective. It hasn't been, but like we have the time, I think, and to sip these stories we tell, these proverbs, I give you whatever Foucault, whatever all the Western philosophers, we have the same proverbs. It's just we don't have the name for it. We don't have the people who said it. So if you think we don't have it, but we have it, but it's just they don't say it and say Carl Jung said it. They say it and it's an African proverb. So using those things and writing about those things and picking and adding and making it a whole knowledge system and write, and you could pick a whole proverb, make it a theoretical basis for your PhD. One proverb, and use it as a theoretical basis for your work. You can use one proverb as a theoretical basis for your design. You can use Sankofa as a whole thing to start designing things and say, what are some of the, like I'm building a house. What are some of the, like I'm building a space. What are some of the things I can go back and then pick? So I think it's there. It's up to us to constantly highlight it, write about it, and pick and understand. I think it's always like not understanding, being comfortable with your culture. So you're not really comfortable bringing those to the front. So that's, yeah.
Thank you so much, Yaw. And thank you, Lawrence, for this rich conversation. And thank you to everyone who's here and the ways in which we've embodied some of the values we're talking about by stretching time, being understanding of, Wi-Fi gaps. So thank you for embodying these values also within this very conversation. And finally, thank you to the DRS EdSig team for your openness and for accommodating all of us. And my hope is that this is just the beginning, that we can continue this conversation on LinkedIn, I've shared both Lawrence and Yaw's details. So please, hopefully we can continue this conversation. Thank you, everybody.